Welcome back, everyone. And now time to change tune a little bit and talk about housing policy in 2023. My name is Sandra Windsor, I'm a senior economist at CEDA. I think what is clear is that housing policy is firmly back on the government policy agenda and also a hot topic within the community. And we're seeing particular concerns at the moment about the availability and affordability of housing, particularly rentals. We've got vacancy rates at record lows across the country, rising rental prices, adding to broader cost of living pressures and some of the energy price concerns that we heard about in the earlier session. So it is really important that we get housing policy right. And the announcement of a new housing accord in last year's federal budget has certainly raised hopes of better targeted policy and leading to real change. And as an overarching policy document, the Housing Accord has some real positives. After years of policy focused almost exclusively on first home buyers and demand-side assistance, the Accord has a much stronger supply-side focus, and it also includes a few more commitments around rental housing, which is increasingly an area of concern. These are welcome changes and set the scene for a broader conversation focused on getting all Australians into stable and secure housing. And along with the Accord, the Albanese government has also announced the establishment of a Housing Australia Future Fund and a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, further cementing the importance of this issue. We've got a great panel here to talk about the outlook for housing in policy this year. And each of our panellists will make some brief opening comments, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A. Please start popping your questions in Pigeonhole now. And please join me in welcoming our very impressive panel this morning. We've got Professor Emma Baker, Director from the Australian Centre for Housing Research, Julie Toth, Chief Economist at PEXA, and Alexander Wendler, Chief Executive Officer of Landcom. Emma, I'm going to start with you to make some opening comments. But please pop questions in now. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, and thanks so much for having me today. We've been asked to just speak for about 2 minutes just to kind of flag some ideas that might encourage questions and answers at the end. And so I think I want to hit you with 3. The first is to say that the Housing Accord, from my perspective as a housing researcher, is an incredibly positive step. It's ambitious and it sets pretty solid housing goals. If we watch the public discussion about it, I think the biggest criticism that keeps coming up is that it's light on the detail. And I think what I want to say today is I think that's probably a strength of the Housing Accord, because it's really kind of a plan that needs to build consensus and quite slowly. And it probably needs to, or almost certainly needs to, bring together people like the people in this room, people from all levels of government, people from industry, people from the finance sector, people that haven't really spoken very well together on housing issues before. So I think it takes some time, and that's a positive. What's my second point? So my second point from reflection on the Housing Accord is that, while a lot of the discussion at the moment in the press and in policy work is focused on that 1 million new houses, the 1 million new houses is a fantastic thing. But I think one thing that we shouldn't do is forget the other 10 million houses that we've already got, and that it's probably those 10 million that are going to give us the biggest wins in solving many of our housing challenges. The third thing I want to kind of drag into the conversation is a mention of the rental sector. Rental has been growing in Australia for the last decade or so. It's now what we call tenure number 2. So there's home purchasers, and then there's renters, and then there's outright homeowners. So it's a big section of our housing market, and people rent for a number of reasons. They might be, and I've always pushed this story, renting strategically and renting by choice, but actually that makes up, realistically, quite a small section. A lot of people are renting because they can't get into home ownership and they can't afford to put together a deposit. I think that's probably a reflection of more of the rental sector than the home ownership sector. So the rental sector, when we look at the data and we look at what's happening in the sector, no wonder people don't want to live in it. It's twice as likely to be cold, it's twice as likely to be unaffordable, it's, you know, twice as likely to have poor conditions. So, you know, I think one of the challenges for us is not how do we get more people into home ownership, how do we make rental something that people actually want to live in for their life? And it should be pretty achievable. Thank you. I'll pass on to Alex.
Okay, yes, thanks, and thanks for having me. Today, I'm in the midst of distinguished economists and researchers, so I will provide the on-the-ground perspective. And I'm conscious that it's a national audience today, so people will not know, or not everybody will know Lancome. So obviously we had the video played before. But we are a commercial business owned by the New South Wales government. And we develop land for two purposes. For the purpose to achieve public outcomes, but at the same time as well financial outcomes for the people of our state. And over the last 5 years, we delivered 12,600 or over 12,600 home sites and 50,000 over the last 10 years. And we are planning to deliver more than 25,000 by 2030, just to explain the magnitude and our understanding of the market. So we help the government of the day to realize the urban management objectives that they have. And our 4 focus points that we have at the moment, one is the supply of housing. Increase the supply of housing, of affordability, and as well of diversity of housing. The second one, and that is part of this broader program, is to look at finding better ways of achieving affordable housing, with a particular focus on affordable rental. Coming back, Emma, to what you said, you know, it's a very, very important problem because it's not only an economic problem, but it's a social problem that we have. And so therefore that's our second focus point. The third one as well, because it is a social problem and has become one over the last few years, is we're expanding into the regions just to alleviate the problems there that we see. Some of the regions have been impacted by floods, by fires, and so on, so that even makes it worse than what it was before. And finally, the fourth point is we're doing it sustainably. And when I say sustainability, I mean environmental sustainability, but as well social sustainability. So our aim is to make a positive difference in people's lives and to create places that we are proud of, but much more important, that the communities are proud of. Places that support people to build a good life and that contribute to our well-being as a society. And this is why we at Lancome are challenging ourselves. We know that business as usual isn't working. We welcome as well the accord, very much so, and working with other parties. But it really means we have to challenge ourselves to do things differently to solve the issues. So we are working with our partners all across what we're doing to identify practical solutions, on-the-ground examples that are feasible, scalable, and replicable. That's really important, these 3 things, because otherwise we can't find a solution that addresses the scale of the problem. But it's not easy, and talking now about on-the-ground experiences, we have many constraints, and you know we all have spoken about them, but I just would like to make sure that we all are aware of them. Access to developable land, very long planning processes. Importantly, community angst about density and change in general, and this is a quite important point. Lack of transport and infrastructure, and there are particular feasibility challenges to deliver affordable housing and affordable rental housing, and obviously that's where the accord is focused on, and that's great. And there are still misunderstandings and stigma when it comes to affordable housing. Shouldn't forget that. We see this every day, that people just have the weirdest understanding of what that is and are afraid of that, having that in their community. So obviously we need well thought through policy. That's great. We as well need the funding from the federal government, and that's hopefully coming as well. But we need as well a big change in mindset across our whole society. It's a social, economic, and environmental challenge that we all have a role to play. So we all need to reassess our attitude to density and infill development, our way to allocate transport and infrastructure funding and other budgets, our approach to planning and how to achieve our very important ecological goals. These are the hurdles that we see every day on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Alex. And thanks everyone for including PEXA in this discussion today. may not be familiar with PEXA, so it might be worth me just explaining why we're here and why PEXA is so interested in the problem of affordable and available housing. As a company, we facilitate almost all property transactions nationally through the settlement process and our exchange platform. So that's all property sales and the loans and mortgages that go with them. But we're also genuinely interested in bringing our industry insights and our involvement in the industry and our expertise to help look at these problems. When we think about the housing policy debate nationally that's going on at the moment, affordability always seems to be in the headline, but actually it's a bit bigger and deeper than that. So I wanted to pick up on just 3 aspects of the housing policy debate that we'd like to take forward from here. The first of those is just thinking about what is the shape of the policy debate? What are we trying to achieve with housing policy? Is it just the pricing and the affordability element, or are there other aspects that we've already touched on? So just as a first principle of good policy research, going back to the basics, what are the objectives? A handy starting point is actually just the concept of housing as a human right, which is recognised globally. But what does that mean exactly? It's a bit more than just a minimum standard. It's more than just houses that are only as good as tents. The Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, talks about it's a right to somewhere that's adequate. And they identify 7 factors of adequacy, and only one of those is actually affordability. The others are legal security of tenure, so that speaks deeply to what we see in the rental market, for example. There's the availability of services, facilities, infrastructure, the location, accessibility, habitability, which is, we already talked about that a little bit in the energy discussion this morning, and cultural adequacy. So all of these dimensions are part of the policy debate that we need to be thinking about. The second aspect is leadership in the policy debate and the respective roles of business and government, and particularly the levels of government. Australia's got 3 levels of government, and all of them are deeply involved in housing policy and regulation. But interestingly, we haven't always had a federal housing minister, and we haven't always had a national housing policy. There's been a lot of periods where it has been completely devolved to state and local government level. So this reinstatement of a federal government leadership role is a really interesting development, and I think a very, very welcome one. The third aspect is also a key focus of the Housing Accord and just the policy tone more generally with the incoming federal government that we've seen, which is the focus on evidence-based and data and research to really build a solid base and insight and evaluation in housing policy. And this is really important because it's such an emotive topic, and it brings in almost every discipline you can think of. It brings in economics, planning, environmental science, social science, everything comes together. And actually this is the area where PEXA's got the most interest. We've got the exchange data. We've also got really great research partners, one of whom's in the room today, ID, Ivan here, who works very closely with local and state governments nationally. And what we're trying to do there is really promote the use of evidence at all of those stages to inform the housing decisions and the planning decisions that are being made. The data sources themselves are quite interesting. Emma will talk a little bit, I'm sure, about what they're doing at Adelaide University. We've traditionally relied really heavily on the census and on various surveys, but increasingly we are seeing a wider range of administrative and transactional data, and that comes from companies like PEXA, but also from the utilities. There's some really great pieces of information coming out there. So we could think more broadly and definitely more collaboratively about how we bring the evidence together to inform the policy debate.
Thanks, Julie. Emma, look, I might come back to you to start with. and focus a little bit more on the rental question. And picking up a thread from the previous session as well, where there was a lot of discussion around the quality of rental housing and how that is impacting on energy costs as well. So what are some of the big issues around the rental market, and where would you like to see the kind of most policy change there as well?
Look, it's really interesting how different the rental sector is to the home-owned sector in Australia. I mean, you've got a slightly different population, but we've got a third of us are living in rental. So Julie's just alluded to, we run the National Housing Conditions Survey, so we're just getting the early results of the first 22,000 Australian households and seeing, what conditions are like in their owned and rented homes. A lot of things stand out. The general condition it tends to be poorer in the rental. That said, it's heterogeneous from the last discussion, but in general, conditions are a lot poorer. And looking back to the last session, there's a lot of catch up to do in terms of energy efficiency, insulation. In fact, from memory, about 75% of tenants don't even know if they've got insulation. They just know they have to turn the heater on to pull it out. And, there's a lot of work going on at the moment about how you can put solar panels on a house, for a tenant, but in an owned property. I think there's a whole lot of low-hanging fruit in the rental question. There's a whole lot of stuff about quality and condition, but I think the big thing that is so easily changed is about tenure security and stability. So, when we look at average lease lengths across Australia, you probably wouldn't even guess. The great majority of people have a lease length of between 6 months and 12 months. Now, they could roll them over, but you think about the planning that you do for your day and your family and all of those other things. You can't plan for a kind of a life if you're only expecting to be in your house for between 6 and 12 months or having to renegotiate it. So I think, there's some quality and condition issues. There's tenure security, but there's no reason why we can't fix that. And in addition to that, I would say that, what else have we got? Tenure security and when you look at tenants, about 80% expect to eventually be in home ownership, and probably only about 20% will. I'll pass it back to you.
Just to jump in about tenure security, because I'm originally from Germany, and that makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. My grandparents never owned. They rented their whole life. My brother, he's a partner at a big law firm. It's not a money question, but he rents as well, but he knows he can plan, and whenever he wants to do something else. So it is, I think that is the biggest, I agree with you, Emma. That is a big thing that should be easy to be done, right? Yeah.
And an interesting contrast in the Australian market is the standard sort of tenancy arrangements for commercial and industrial tenants. There's no way a retailer would be able to operate with only 6 to 12 months security, and 3 times 3, 3 years times 3 is fairly standard, and in many cases it stretches beyond that. So certainly within Australia's own market, we do have established precedents there for extending it.
Alex, I might start with you on this next one. Talked a lot about the housing accord and the role of collaboration. So in order to get successful outcomes, we need this collaboration from the private sector and also all levels of government. What are you seeing? Are you seeing more collaboration already happening, or what are you seeing that needs to happen for that to kind of play out more effectively?
I think it's a very good start because it calls in builders, it calls in financial institutions and so on. But in the end, it's a big spectrum that everybody works on. We are land developers, so we buy land, we develop land, put infrastructure in, put parks in. But in the end, then we need to work with community housing providers. Let's say when we talk about affordable rental housing, they obviously have their own struggles with equity. They have their own struggles with debt. Now in particular with the whole high costs of interest. So therefore we need to then work with let's say NIFIC or Housing Australia but as well with commercial banks. and with financial institutions that can provide equity. And the discussion has been started about super funds, other institutional investors. So in the end, just looking at an affordable housing project as part of our bigger community, you already have to talk to all of these parties, right? And then we talk about, we have obviously other kind of diverse products, and then we talk about developers, builders, and so on. So therefore, I see that the call out that we all have to work together, we have to change our thinking, is a very important one. And I'm very positive about it. I would say that I would hope that access to the funding comes faster, because I think that's possibly one of the big discussion points. Because these projects take time to actually get off the ground. And maybe before I hand over, I just want to say what's important as well, what I just is another stakeholder is local councils. So we are working closely with local councils, let's say in the Northern Rivers. We're doing projects with CHPs, community housing providers, on local government land. And therefore, it is really a very wide net. If you want to make a difference, everybody has to work together.
Do you want to add anything?
Is it okay if I, just to kind of take up that collaboration point, I think looking back over the last decade, one of the great problems for us, and this goes to your point, Julie, is without something like a National Housing Supply Council, what we then kind of reverted to was this situation where there was no song sheet to all sing from. So every different bit of the puzzle went off and created their own data and then sang from that. And so I think that was one of the most kind of backward steps we could have done. So in terms of bringing us together, I think we shouldn't underestimate how important the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council will be in providing that reliable one-stop data set that we can all kind of work together on.
Yeah, and providing visibility, because there's quite a few elements where we have really good visibility of, say, one location or one part of the market, and other areas that are in the dark. So, for example, we have great transparency for property sales and transactions in some states, but not others. And that's to do with, partly to do with their ability to join in with the national transaction system, but also just their willingness to share data, and that's probably a bigger problem. Just sitting inside PEXA as an economist, I can see that we've got this amazing data, for example, but not all of it is available to researchers and to other areas of government, and the agencies are keeping their bits locked away from each other.
I might stay on this topic of data and the new National Housing Supply and Affordability Council for a moment. Julie, you've got this big stack of data, and Emma, I know you've got data as well. What would be your wish for this new council? You've got the data, give it to them. What policy issues do you want them to be focusing on to start with? What are the big ones?
Yeah, I'd like to see a fairly strong focus on the supply of housing. A lot of the policy measures that we see nationally from state governments and nationally have a very strong focus on demand boosting and demand management. Looking at more closely at the supply of housing, where is the underutilisation, where can we do the infills? It happens at a local government level, and certainly with the land management by state governments. But I think that more of that is definitely possible when we look at the composition of our cities and towns.
I think my recollection from the previous Supply Council was this really reliable, useful data for stock and supply, and a good look at prediction. So an agreed prediction, upper, middle, and lower. I think if we could just tweak it a little bit, and I think in the language of the naming, putting affordability in there's some thought going to tweaking it a little bit. I think rather than just looking at the number of dwellings and where they are and where they will be, and maybe even extending it to the population, that there's probably a need for putting people back into the mix. So what I mean by that is to be looking at questions of adequacy as well as affordability and the livability. You know, who do we want to live in these houses and why and where? So I think that's all really useful. And I do wonder, I have wondered for a while, you know, with such a big focus coming on energy efficiency and climate change and all of those questions, there should probably be a module of that council that is dedicated to look at kind of looking at where we're going to, because the changes, as we've seen from the last panel session, are so extreme that it's hard to fit it into traditional models.
The other area I'd like to single out on the supply side is I think nationally we need to get a much better handle on the construction industry's capacity and capability. You know, what is a reasonable target? I know we've got this big number out there at the moment of 1 million new homes over 5 years, but actually that's about the rate that we've been building homes for quite a long time. It is the 5-year average for construction of new homes being added to the stock. So, you know, I'd like to see a little bit more work done on what is a reasonable capacity, and then using that to set some reasonable targets that are achievable for adding to the stock, or, as you say, you know, adjusting the existing housing stock to ensure that it is adequate and suitable.
Yeah, so I mentioned before the hurdles, and I mentioned planning processes, I mentioned infrastructure as well. I think if we get the data that you just were speaking about and make sure that this is as well in a form that can be used to then allocate resources, you know, making sure that if there is a particular target, a particular region, sub-region, that there is then willingness of you know, overall government that budgets are allocated that way, so the planning is focused on that infrastructure is focused on that. So I think having more information will very much help.
That's it. I've got a question through about regional areas, and often when we talk about affordability problems, we are thinking about the big cities, you know, what's the median house price in Sydney or Melbourne and the challenges there. But actually our regional areas are having a lot of challenges too, particularly around rentals and availability. So just wondering about, do we need different policy responses in regional areas, and are we seeing any movement on that? Alex, might start with you there.
Yeah, I just want to possibly touch on, you know, the premise of the question, because we are spending a lot of time in the regions at the moment, and even when we talk to local councils, they're saying they can't find staff because they don't have anywhere to live. And same thing with, you know, if we talk to businesses in Tamworth or wherever in Orange, we again, the same thing as well. There are businesses that want to grow, that could grow, but there is nowhere for people to live. So it is a really, really a difficult question. So that's why from an actual point, from a policy point, but from an actual on-the-ground point, what we are doing is we're reaching out to councils and seeing if there's developable land that we can develop in partnership, either with a focus on affordable rental or on putting master plan communities on it. So very much a big push that we are continuing, and therefore I think it's very, very important. There are hurdles, though, if I talk about again on the ground, because construction prices and the shortage of labour and of skills is a hurdle that will make a difference, and therefore in general feasibility of projects. So therefore, when we talk about policy, I just may want to push to let's make sure there's enough of funding available for that to account for the fact that there are in particular feasibility problems.
I suppose the question of the regions really goes to the fact that, you know, obviously the market doesn't provide in the regions because we've ended up in this situation. So that's really that's the value of a plan. It says, okay, as Australians, this is what we want to do, and we make a decision about going to the regions or not, and then we just make it happen in a way.
Yeah, it's a really interesting development in Australia, and it's contrary to the long-term trend, which is people leaving regions and moving into the urban concentrations. And I think the context is really important. This change has happened very quickly, and it's largely been in response to the COVID pandemic and the shocks that have happened there. So from a policy perspective, we need to understand whether this is a long-term structural change or whether it's going to unwind. We don't want to rush out and build whole new suburbs in regional areas that may then become empty. We know, for example, that household size, household density fell dramatically during COVID. People spread out, and that's part of the reason why we see an apparent shortage of homes, even though population growth stalled. There is room for that to unwind, but it's unclear yet how much of it will. But if you think about who was moving to regional areas, there's an awful lot of family-sized homes in regional towns that have now got one or two previous urban dwellers working from home in them, and it's not clear yet whether that's a permanent shift or whether they'll move back.
Maybe another task for the new National Housing Supply and Affordability Council to look into.
Just unpicking the shock response to the pandemic to a longer term structural change that might warrant a supply response.
And I think this is why we all talk about diversity of housing.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not one product that works everywhere. It needs to be quite clear that it needs to focus on the needs of the people. But then just talking, Emma, just were talking about there's nobody in the regions to do all of this. And it's what we see as well. Like developers, the big developers that we all know of, they are focused on the metropolitan areas. And so that's why we are kind of focusing on the regions. But as well, just stressing the feasibility point there, it's we have to cross-subsidize. We have to cross-subsidize of what we do in the regions with what we do in metropolitan areas, because again, otherwise it's not doable, and that's why firms that are only focusing on commercial outcomes and not on public outcomes are not looking there.
The planning side's important too. As an example, someone I met at a housing conference a little while ago from a New South Wales regional town, they'd been delving into the census data for their own area, and they found that 90% of their housing stock for their LGA were large homes, but something like 60% of their households were only one or two people. So they were a little bit shocked and surprised at that, and definitely considering from a planning perspective what type of housing they need to build from there. Even though they've got lots of land, they might need to look at smaller dwellings, for example.
I want to pick up on that point about planning, Julie, and it is one of the key issues under the Housing Accord is how can we improve our planning and regulatory system, and there's a lot of research around this about how Australia's planning and regulatory system, which is often done at local council level, and there's hundreds and hundreds of local councils across Australia, all with slightly different rules, which makes it a very challenging environment. What can we actually do to really change? We talk a lot about changing and improving planning systems, but what can we actually do to see some real change there? And also picking up a point you made in your opening remarks, Alex, about the role of community opposition, because that is often what is holding back some of these changes. Alex, do you want to make some comments there? Or?
Yeah, with community opposition, I understand where it comes from. I think we all look at things differently, depending on if they're in our backyard or they're not. But I think it goes back to the point of being quite clear of the overall objectives. If we want to solve this problem, then we have to be honest and to all of us that we have to accept, we have to work together on finding an acceptable level of density and of how infill is being undertaken. So I think that's something. And just I opened the newspaper this morning, or the electronic version, and there was an article about some density somewhere, and a very negative article. I haven't read it. I don't know. I cannot comment on what developer it is and what kind of density is proposed. But it is the reflex reaction of everybody that when you talk about density, it is just bad. You know, and I think we all need to find ways of changing that, because if we don't change it, political leaders cannot change that. And if we don't have political leaders supporting development, then we have the problems with the councils. Because we have lots of examples. We have an example where we have a building which has been used as a medical facility. It then has been empty for many years, many years, and we want to turn it with the community housing provider into not shelter, but kind of homes for women over 50 at risk of homelessness. We cannot get it through because it is in a wealthier area, and people are concerned. So therefore, that is where I scratch my head and that's why I said it. But yeah, you can see I'm quite taken by these problems, because that's community backlash. The other one, obviously, planning as well. We have this issue. So just to finish my remarks, I think what we need in general is a consensus about what the objective is. If we have a consensus, and I think this is where we are quite well, and going back to the panel before about climate change. I think we all, after many years of infighting, we have a consensus. We know where we want to get to. Everybody has to contribute to it. If we are serious about housing, we then need to be serious about saying quite clearly, this is our objective, and that means planning and councils and everybody, the media, everybody is pulling on the same string.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I think there's a consensus story. Just to kind of add something to the mix, I think when we think of planning, the planning problem in housing, we often think of the new build, but we should be pulling ourselves back occasionally to think of how can the planning system make the existing housing stock work even better. And that, there's a beautiful example, I think, in Queensland in the last 12 months. They got together one day and they said, we have a real problem with people not being able to, and they just changed the granny flat rule instantly. And it just does a little bit to help, but yeah, there's a lot that we can probably do on the existing stock as well.
Yeah, I think that's why I emphasised the importance of national leadership in the policy debate. It's not about sort of one level of government taking charge and overriding, but we do need some coordination and better collaboration across all these agencies.
Fantastic, thank you. We are running close to time, so we'll do the last question. But I think it's a good one that's come through on Pigeonhole, and I'll ask it to each of you with just a relatively brief comment, please. What would success of the Accord look like in 5 years' time? What would you see success? Julie, I might start with you.
Oh, I think the ultimate ideal would be, no or very minimal homelessness across Australia. That would be amazing, but that's very much, at the pinnacle.
Emma?
I probably come to this with with my housing and health hat on a little bit, is that we at least give everyone the opportunity to live in a house that promotes their health, or at least doesn't affect it.
Alex?
Yeah, that the sustainable process has been set up to actually allocate the funds, and that at the end of 5 years or whatever we're looking at as a period, that these funds have been invested in a effective way and very with outcomes, social outcomes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you for all the wonderful questions that have come through on Pigeonhole. I think, lot of positivity around this Accord. So I think, and the new National Housing Affordability and Supply Council, and it sounds like we've got lots of jobs for them to do, and I'm sure they'll be keen to get some data out of both you, Julie and Emma. So please, everyone, if you could thank our fantastic panellists, Alex, Emma and Julie. Thank you, and we'll pass over to Ian Hamilton, Senior Economist at CEDA, for the next session.